Hi, I'm Doug Carroll for Insider's Guide to Finance, and I'm here today to speak to you about some bond market terminology and related contract features that many find confusing. That's especially true for neophytes to the business, but it's terminology and concepts that will oftentimes bedevil even people who've spent the bulk of their careers working with bonds. So, what's always fixed about a fixed income security? It might seem like all the major contract features are reasonable candidates for that characterization, but as we walk through that list, we'll find out that in each case there are numerous exceptions. And one aspect of bonds that is oftentimes characterized as fixed rate of return, as we'll see, that would likely never be the case. So, what's the list of usual suspects? Well, there are 4 components to that list. Let's enumerate them, then talk about the exceptions in each case, and ultimately identify what is always fixed about a fixed income security. So the 4 usual suspects: par value or principal amount, coupon rate, maturity, and rate of return. Let's go through each of these in detail, identify the exceptions, and then identify what indeed is always fixed. So, first up, par value or principal amount. It is the case that for most fixed income securities, the par or principal amount is fixed over the life of the contract. However, there are numerous exceptions to that general case. One obvious exception are inflation indexed securities. TIPS, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities, being a very prominent example. Those are securities whose face amount or par value is adjusted over time for inflation as measured by the Consumer Price Index, so that the coupon payments the investors are receiving is based on a par amount that varies over time, and in fact the maturity value will also reflect the cumulative inflation over the time to maturity. Or a real huge example in terms of proportion of the fixed income market are amortizing securities, things like mortgage-backed securities. So yes, there is an original face amount that is fixed at the time of the contract, but the principal an investor would collect over the remaining life of the security, and the principal amount upon which the investor is collecting interest payments period by period is varying over time as the underlying mortgage pool pays down or returns principal. The amount of principal outstanding is declining. So that while par or principal is usually fixed, there are numerous categories of securities for which that is definitely not the case. Well, if it's not par or principal amount that's always fixed, how about the second item on the list, coupon rate? Again, it is the case that for the vast majority of long-term coupon-paying securities, the coupon rate is fixed over the life of the contract. But again, there are numerous exceptions. For example, there are split rate bonds or split coupon bonds. Split coupon bonds are bonds that do pay a fixed rate of interest. The problem is they pay 2 or more fixed rates of interest for different portions of the life of the security. And an even bigger exception are adjustable rate securities, things like floating rate notes that have a coupon that resets over time at various frequencies, monthly, quarterly, annually, or whatever. And the coupon for any given period will be based on some index rate and a spread to that index rate typically. So while again, most long-term securities do pay a fixed coupon rate of interest, there are again numerous exceptions. Well, we've deposed the first 2 contenders on our list of candidates for the title of always being fixed on a fixed income security. So how about the third item on our list, maturity? It is the case that the vast majority of fixed income securities do have a fixed maturity date. However, if one is interpreting maturity as the timing of the return of principal to the investor, huge swaths of the fixed income market face investors with a great degree of uncertainty about the exact timing of the return of principal. Completely aside from the amortizing securities we talked about earlier, which do indeed have a fixed maturity date. For instance, if one is thinking about a residential mortgage-backed security, the legal maturity date would be the scheduled return of the last dollar of principal on the longest lived mortgage in the underlying mortgage pool. The problem is that by the time of that occurrence, it is likely that 99.99% of the principal has already been returned to investors, and the exact timing of that return of principal to investors is extremely uncertain. So the significance of maturity in that context is very much open to question. But setting aside the amortizers, there are many other types of fixed income securities that face investors with a great degree of uncertainty about the exact timing of the return of principal. For instance, sinking fund bonds is a prime example. A sinking fund bond does have a legal maturity date. The problem is that a sinking fund bond has a sinking fund schedule, which requires the issuer to retire a certain portion of the issue year by year over some portion of the life of the security. So that while the ultimate maturity of the issue is known, the exact timing of the return of principal to individual bondholders that own a piece of that issue is very uncertain, because the holders of individual bonds don't know whether their particular security will be outstanding all the way till the ultimate maturity, or might be retired in one of the earlier years due to a sinking fund call. Or another huge exception would be asset-backed or commercial mortgage-backed securities, where there is a legal maturity date, but also an anticipated maturity date. The anticipated maturity date is the date at which the structure anticipates returning the final dollars of principal to investors in the debt tranches. But under certain circumstances, for instance, if some of the balloon or interest-only loans cannot be refinanced as anticipated, the structure has the possibility of deferring the return of principal from beyond the anticipated maturity date to as late as the legal maturity date. And then a huge portion of the fixed income market is made up of callable securities, which means while there is a legal maturity date, the issuer has the right to, in effect, accelerate the effective maturity by calling those securities sometime prior to the maturity date. So whereas again, as in the first two cases with maturity, most fixed income securities do have a maturity date. But if one is thinking of maturity as return of principal to the investors, huge portions of the market cause investors to be operating under a great degree of uncertainty as to exactly when they're going to get their principal returned. How about the fourth item on the list? Believe it or not, it's the most problematic of the bunch. Because even though it might seem quite natural to interpret fixed income as meaning fixed rate of return, and in fact, most basic books will define yield to maturity as the rate of return to an investor who buys a bond and holds it to maturity, almost nothing could be further from the truth, at least if one is talking about coupon bonds. Because to know the rate of return to maturity, for income to be fixed in that sense, one would have to know the rate of return earned on all the cash flows received prior to maturity that would be generated over the time to the maturity of the security. And since reinvestment rates or future returns are impossible to forecast, it would be impossible to know your rate of return to maturity. Now again, that's talking about coupon bonds. On a zero coupon bond, as long as there's no default, if held from purchase all the way to maturity, one would know the rate of return to maturity. Although as it turns out, it wouldn't be the yield to maturity, but now we're getting into issues related to compounding periods versus annual rates of return, and that's beyond the scope of this discussion. But when talking about the majority of fixed income securities that either pay coupons and or return principal prior to the stated maturity, if one doesn't know the return earned from the receipt of that cash flow all the way until the maturity of the debt, how could one possibly know the rate of return to maturity? So clearly, fixed income doesn't mean fixed rate of return. So if none of these items fit the bill, what is always fixed about a fixed income security? That is the relationship between the bond issuer and the bond investors, the contractual relationship that establishes the rights and obligations that exist between those two counterparties. That might be established via legislation by some federal or local government, or in the case of publicly offered bonds in the United States, securities regulations require that such securities be issued under a trust indenture, a contract that specifies, well, in very simplistic terms, the obligations of the issuer and the rights of the investors. But that's what's always fixed about a fixed income security, the contract that establishes the legal groundwork that sets the terms of the relationship between the bond issuers and the bond investors. I hope you enjoyed this video. You can go to our YouTube channel or Facebook page to see other videos on a range of investment-related topics. Or you can go to the website, insidersguidetofinance.com. At our website, in addition to the free video shorts, there are a series of modestly priced, in-depth training videos with running times of approximately 1 hour each that go into a number of subjects in greater detail. The website and Facebook page also contain information about open enrollment programs I will be presenting over the next few months and my recently released book, The Insider's Guide to Fixed Income Securities and Markets.